Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to another exciting lecture by Dr. Ronald J. Brown. Our topic for today is Eleanor Roosevelt, the first modern First Lady. Really set the bar very high for what First Ladies are all about. There's nothing in the Constitution about First Ladies, a lot about the President. And so the first ladies have basically been required to create their own persona. Some play a major role, some do not. Some are negative roles, some are very positive. Well, Eleanor is definitely a first lady who everybody recognizes and established what the modern first lady should be all about. So here is our outline. First ladies become activists rather than just a woman who takes care of the White House and arranges flowers. First ladies like Eleanor Roosevelt were activists, involved in society, taking positions, speaking their mind. The life of Eleanor, once again, a New York Knickerbocker, going back to the Dutch period in New York. Eleanor as an independent political figure, not reflecting everything that her husband might say, but having her own opinion. In the White House years 33 to 45, and then following the White House years and the death of her husband, the alone years, 45 to 62. So let's get started on our discovery of Eleanor Roosevelt. Well, a lot has been written recently about first ladies. For example, we see the book American First Ladies, again, chronicling the ladies of importance. That's Eleanor at the bottom on the left. First Lady, a modern fairy tale, a movie about first ladies. On the right, an entire encyclopedia devoted to first ladies. And once again, we see almost in the middle of the picture, Eleanor Roosevelt, again featuring prominently. Well, she was preceded by Lou Henry Hoover, a gallant first lady. Well, President Hoover is sort of a rather controversial president because, as you can see from the dates, he was in the White House during the Great Depression. So she was the first lady, 29 to 33 for one term. So when Eleanor moved in and took her place, she definitely said, well, I'm not going to be a nondescript, gallant first lady. I am going to be a major political figure. Her mother, Anna Rebecca Hall Roosevelt. Her father, Elliott Bullock Roosevelt. Here again, Gilded Age aristocrats, Fifth Avenue mansions, houses in the Hamptons, the Roosevelts going way back to the Dutch period. You can't get more Knickerbocker than that. Here we see the picture of father and Eleanor and Elliot Jr. Okay, the mother passed away when Eleanor was 8 years old. Her brother Elliot died in 1893 when Eleanor was 9. Elliot was a bit, what can we say? Mentally disturbed, it seems, and attempted suicide various times. And her father died when Eleanor was 10. So really a rather bad setup for the growth of a young girl. She was farmed out to the Allenswood Academy, which was where she did her education at the age of 15 in 1899. And from the picture, you can see that it was a very elegant school for proper young ladies. Now, a lot of the older women in my family attended such academies. On the right, you see the National Park Seminary for young women in Washington, D.C., where a number of the ladies in my family attended. I was once talking to my grandmother, who went to private schools, and I asked her, what was the biggest high point of your year at the schools? And she said, well, I especially loved the informal trips which we took, where we would get in a carriage drawn by horses and go off into the woods somewhere where we'd have a picnic in nature. And I said, well, why was it called informal? And she said, it was unusual because we were allowed to remove our white gloves. And so this is the elite education of young ladies. Her debutante ball was held, of course, at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York in 1902 when she was 18 years old. And this was when a young lady was considered to be marriageable, an adult, her education finished, and she was on the market for a husband. Well, we see so many pictures of Eleanor as an older woman, but here we see her as a young 18-year-old girl. She married her fifth cousin in 1905 at the age of 21. This is young Mr. Roosevelt again. We think of FDR always as an old dour president, but here we see him as a young man. We see Eleanor in the middle in her wedding gown, and on her right with her new husband, dressed for a proper high society event. So she conformed to the rules of the age, the Gilded Age, which was rapidly coming to an end in 1905 with the rise of World War I. That would bring this golden age to an end, but she was very much a part of it. The Roosevelts, of course, they were divided into two rival branches. The Hyde Park Roosevelts, we had their mansions in Hyde Park. The Oyster Bay Roosevelts, who were descended from another branch of the Roosevelts, and they were constantly battling. But yet, when Eleanor married, there was sort of a bridge between the two rival branches. Not well viewed by her family, but yet he was, after all, a Roosevelt. Happily married, 1906 to 1916, six children were born, and we see the children gathered around with Roosevelt holding the latest edition on her lap. We don't see much emotion in either of them. They must have been a rather cold couple to their children, but yet, she did her wifely duty as producing the necessary heirs to this aristocratic family. Well, disaster struck in 1918 when Mr. President Roosevelt, who was not yet president, but FDR, ended up having an affair with Lucy Mercer, who later married and became a Rutherford. And Eleanor, of course, as good society, remained with him, although she lived separately beginning in 1918. She had a house built called Valkill in Hyde Park, just up the Hudson River from New York. Today, it's the Eleanor Roosevelt National Historic Site. And that's where she lived and led a very independent life, but yet remained officially married, showing up at all the proper events where a good aristocratic family from New York had to show their presence. A lot has been written about what they call an extraordinary marriage of Franklin and Eleanor, but yet they kept up appearances as a married couple. But it was well known that he was off with his girlfriend, and from what we know now, she was off having her affairs. So it was a rather convenient marriage. They remained what we would call today a power couple, where the wife and the husband are a team, both highly educated, both with firm ideas of what should happen in the world. Hillary and Bill were considered a power couple. She was no wallflower in that arrangement. And we see Bill and Hillary Clinton, the White House years, a team. And on the right, we see a book, The Power Couple Formula, where a man and a woman get married, both very ambitious, both out to change the world, and live together in spite of infidelities and affairs and everything else, because it was like a corporation. It was a business arrangement. Well, following the breakup, not really the breakup, but the separation, living separately, Eleanor really came into her own. In the early 20s, these were the roaring 20s. Greenwich Village, Harlem were the places where culture was booming. Gays and lesbians were coming out of the closet in Greenwich Village and in Harlem. Music was changing, fashions were changing, the role of women were changing. And we see the book on the right by Cook, The Defining Years. These years of the 20s were when Eleanor really completed her education on the streets of New York, in Harlem, jazz clubs, in the wild parties in Greenwich Village. And so here again, they were considered very important formative years for Eleanor. The Roaring Twenties, F. Scott Fitzgerald, the Jazz Age stories, Voices of Harlem. Well, it was at this time when Eleanor was already becoming an independent person that her husband was struck with polio in August 1921. She was instrumental in convincing him that polio did not mark the end of his career. She helped him through the dramatic period of not being able to walk, of braces, of wheelchairs, and of, well, probably the Great Depressions that really occurred. And she was viewed as instrumental in convincing him that he should continue his political career. And in 1929, another fateful year, he was elected governor of New York. Well, Eleanor was part of his career. She, even though she had her own house at Valkill, she still appeared with him, was part of this power team. FDR was New York State Senator following governor. He was Assistant Secretary of Navy, Governor of New York State. And so throughout his career, he was a major political figure. And you see the big gap between Assistant Secretary of Navy 1919 and then his governor. There's a 10-year gap there that was during his dealing with his illness. Well, during the 20s, the role of women was changing across the country, beginning with the Seneca Falls movement in 1848 up in upstate New York. Women got the right to vote. They were independent. They started getting an education. And so she was very much a product of this rise of women's consciousness. 1919. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. And here's another book, National Geographic, The Country's First Ladies, again featuring Eleanor as the major woman who really established the role of the First Lady. The years of the late 1800s was also a troubled time. There was a time of strikes. The Haymarket strike in May 1st of 1886 in Chicago established May 1 as May Day. Well, the Pinkertons and the National Guard and the police massacred workers, arrested them. Their leaders were hung. So the United States does not celebrate May Day. We have our own Labor Day, which nobody celebrates, but the rest of the world celebrates May 1. Women were working outside the home, working in factories. Here we see a textile factory where women were joining the labor force. The National Women's Trade Union League, founded in 1903. Here again, if we look at the slogan, the 8-hour day, a living wage, and guard the home. If you look at the woman on the left, she's holding a baby, arguing that a woman could have a career, she could have a job, she could work, but she could also be a mother. Another big movement in the labor movement, especially regarding women, was the March 25th, 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York, where 146 women were killed because they could not escape the factory floors, which were on the top floor of a 10-story building. So women were coming into their own. Here we see movements of Women's Trade Union League in New York protesting bad wages, protesting working hours, demanding better conditions. So she was very much a part of this. She saw what was happening in the country during the early 1900s. Well, then along came World War I, which ended the Gilded Age, and the United States entered World War I reluctantly in 1917, almost towards the end of the war. But the United States emerged following the war as a major world power. Woodrow Wilson ended up rebuilding the country as an industrial and military powerhouse. And so this was going on, and young Eleanor was part of this, witnessing it. Well, polio was the major event in FDR's job. I mean, you would never see him walking with braces on his legs, as in the middle picture. He was never photographed in a wheelchair. These were pictures which only came out later. Whenever he was giving a speech or an interview or a press conference, as you can see from the picture on the right, he was always grasping the podium because it was difficult for him to stand. And so he was a major political figure as governor and then later as president, due largely to the support of Eleanor. Well, as they were in Albany, or as governor from 1929 to 32, the Great Depression hit New York. And they both were very conscious of the suffering of ordinary people. Even though they were New York aristocrats from Fifth Avenue, unlike most rich people, they had a very deep concern for the welfare of the working class. He was a Democrat. He was not a rich Republican. And so they both entered the Depression as deeply concerned about the working situation. Well, in 1933, at the height of the Great Depression, FDR was elected president, and they moved into the White House. So even though they were living very separate lives, as a power couple, they definitely worked together. Sometimes at odds with each other, but usually as a team. Lorena entered the picture as a female reporter who became very close to Eleanor. And we see the book Ladies of Courage by Eleanor Roosevelt and Lorena Hickok. Of course, back then, to have a lesbian affair was not something people spoke about, but they were both high achieving women. Eleanor as the First Lady and Reina as a female reporter accredited to the White House for the Associated Press. And so this became another power couple in this complex marriage. Eleanor was outspoken. She was the first lady to hold regular press conferences. She only admitted women to her press conferences, saying that their country is going to get a woman's view on what is happening around the world. And of course, you can see CBS was there, NBC, all the major news broadcasting agencies were there and reporting it. And she spoke her mind. So she was not just arranging the drapes and refurbishing the White House. I mean, she had her own opinion, her own career. She wrote a daily newspaper column, My Day in the White House, where she chronicled the life of a president confronting the Great Depression, the New Deal, civil rights, United Nations, and chronicled the life of a president and first lady living daily in the White House. And so her column was widely read, again establishing her as a major figure. She had her weekly radio show, begun on April 30th, 1940, where again she expressed her opinion. She mastered modern media. We think of John Kennedy mastering television. Well, Eleanor Roosevelt was mastering radio and the press before the age of television. And so she understood the power of the mass media. She spoke at national party conventions, speaking her mind. Most first ladies just didn't even attend. This was a man's affair. But now, with women having the right to vote, she had her own audience. She spoke her mind on civil rights, on lynching, and the military, a fighter for justice, strongly supported the Anti-Lynching Act. Now, this was a point where she had some problems with FDR. FDR needed the support of the southern states, which were firmly Democratic. And if she came out too strongly in favor of civil rights, lynching, or the integration of the military, it caused serious problems. When Marian Anderson was refused permission to sing at a national event, Eleanor invited her to sing before the Lincoln Memorial, where 75,000 people showed up. And she considered herself a very close friend of Marian Anderson. Civil rights was a major issue that she took a strong position on. Gradually, African Americans started getting civil rights, but it was a long, drawn out affair. But yet, as we can see from the map, FDR had to keep the support of the southern states because there were, and especially in the northern states, a lot of opposition to his programs. Here we see the map of the Dixiecrats that he needed the support of, even though this was the age of lynching and it was the age of apartheid segregation. During World War II, she played a major role, demanding the integration of the military, again endangering FDR with his constituents in the southern states. But she did not hesitate to visit the front lines, to speak to the troops, and demand the integration of every level of the military. She traveled, met with kings and queens and rulers in Europe, and was entertained by the troops who would put on shows for her to show how much they appreciated her. She was behind the decision to admit 200,000 refugees from the Hitler's Europe. The United States was not overly welcoming to Holocaust victims and those faced with the Holocaust, but she demanded that at least 200,000 be admitted. The death of FDR in April 12, 1945, marked the end of their White House years, dealing with the Depression, dealing with World War II, dealing with racism and women's rights, which really marked the Roosevelt presidency. And she encouraged him all along to stay involved. It was her decision and her prodding that forced him to run for governor and then to run for president. You can imagine what might have happened if he had gone into a depression and stayed in New York and not undertaken this political career. But historians attribute that largely to Eleanor's support. The alone years, 45 to 62. So we're at 12, 16 years. Lorena remained her close companion throughout all of these years. Later, books were written, The Life of Lorena Hickok, Eleanor Roosevelt's friend. Here again, it was still not a topic that people discussed in public during these years. But Eleanor remained very active in these alone years. Strong supporter of the United Nations and bringing the United Nations to New York City. She spoke in favor of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a major supporter of the UN, speaking, giving conferences, writing articles, traveling in support of this new institution. The human rights that she demanded included the ones on the left, the right to life, liberty, abolition of slavery, right to a trial, right to privacy, right to a nationality. This is very important today, right? No discrimination, equality before the law. These are great and lofty sentiments, unfortunately, especially today, are being violated around the world. But still, she was a major supporter of this ideal society where human rights would be respected by all countries. The right to marry and have a family, the right to work, the right to an education, still a major issue for women and African Americans in the 1950s. The human rights can't be taken away as they are given to every human by their creator. Governments do not have the right to take away the human rights. She served as on the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women in her last years and was very involved in politics. It is said that she didn't really get along very well with President Kennedy, but yet he did appoint her to the Commission for the Status of Women, which she served until her death. Lots of books have been written. NBC News has a video on the long rumored romance. Susan Quinn's book, Eleanor and Hick, The Love Affair, I mean, coming right out and saying that it was more than just a friend, as Doris Faber's book hints. She wrote extensively. Her letters were printed and really indicate that her relationship with Lorena was more than just a friendship, that it was a deep love relationship. Well, Eleanor, speaking her mind, had her problems. J. Edgar Hoover was not much of a great lover of Eleanor because she came right out and condemned censorship and condemned J. Edgar Hoover as a danger to the United States. You can see from the book on the left. The cumulative effect is overwhelming. Eleanor Roosevelt was right. Hoover's FBI was an American Gestapo. So she had no qualms about attacking people with power if she thought they were corrupt or were not doing good for the country. Well, again, the woman who established the role of first ladies. A new book which just came out more recently, The Saga of the President's Wives and Their Power, 1961 to 1990. Here again, showing how Eleanor Roosevelt transformed the role of the First Lady. Now, once again, some first ladies are very aggressive, very ambitious, very outspoken. In fact, as we speak, there was a movie just released by Donald Trump's first lady, chronicling her life, again, speaking her mind. And so this role of First Lady is a rather unique institution. Once again, there's nothing in the Constitution about the role of a First Lady. In fact, the name, the First Lady, was coined by George Washington's wife. Mrs. Washington was not satisfied in being a simple Mrs. Washington. Now, George Washington was perfectly happy being President Washington or Mr. Washington or Mr. President. Although there were arguments saying he should be titled His Elected Majesty or be given some kind of a royal title, well, he refused. In fact, the Constitution forbade all royal titles in the United States. But Mrs. Washington was not satisfied in being Mrs. President or Mrs. Washington, and she insisted on being called Lady Washington, lady with a capital L. Now, lady is of minor aristocracy in England. We know lords and ladies. Well, it is a minor aristocratic title. It's not a prince or a duke or anything like that. Well, she insisted on adopting this royal title as Lady Washington. Well, George Washington was never Lord Washington. Well, after Mrs. Washington and George left the White House, subsequent first ladies did not use the title lady capitalized with their name. Thomas Jefferson, his wife, was not Lady Jefferson. The name became First Lady, and lady was very often no longer capitalized. It became a title, First Lady. And so the role of first ladies evolved over time. Every first lady making contributions to it, others not making contributions to the role of the first lady. So that brings us to an end of this exciting discovery of Eleanor Roosevelt. So this is Ronald J. Brown logging off. Thank you for joining me, and I hope to see you again in the future for another exciting talk.